Daniel here with Propelio again. We're going to continue the mobile homes course today, and what we're going to be talking about is essentially the units themselves and the construction types. As you're driving through a mobile home park, it's going to be important for you to be able to recognize what type of homes you're looking at. So that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today. And as investors, we're going to need to be able to recognize what we're looking at. We're going to discuss in this class man, can I start over, please? Please.
Yeah, from here, just start over
From the beginning.
Yeah, from the.
Let's just. I'll get it good. I'll get it good today. All right. You ready?
Yeah.
Hey everybody, this is Daniel here with Propelio, and we're back here for the rest of the mobile home courses. And one of the big pieces of being a mobile home investor is being able to drive through a mobile home park and quickly identify what types of homes you're looking at. So in today's class, what we're going to be looking at is common types and sizes of homes, the siding and roofing materials that we'll be looking at, as well as the kind of the year built. There's big differences between homes from the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up into the 2000s. Massive differences between those. We'll be talking about those as well, and we'll be going through some of the typical unit configurations that we will see in these homes. So that's what we'll be talking about here in today's class. Construction type and sizes. I'm positive most everybody out there understands what I mean when I say I've got a single wide mobile home, but I need to make sure that I'm touching all bases here. If I've got a single wide mobile home, they're typically less than 18 foot wide. I've seen them anywhere as short as about 25 foot long to as much as, I think the biggest one I've seen so far was 84 or 86 foot long. And I don't want to be quoted on that, but it was called a super long. So single wides can get pretty damn long. Like imagine something that's, 15, 16 foot wide, 18 foot wide potentially, that's 85, 86 foot long. That's a big single wide home. But single wides have a single section, a single title, single HUD label, and HUD plate. All of that to be said, we've also got double wides. Now double wides are going to often, anything over 18 foot wide has to be a double wide. I do believe that is true, and that's because of transportation reasons. You get more than 18 foot wide, it becomes extremely difficult to transport in a single section. But since it is a double wide, and I think I've talked about this in some of the other classes, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it again because it never hurts to tell you twice. Double wide has two titles. It has two VIN numbers, it has two HUD labels, it has two HUD plates. All of it has two, and it'll be the exact same serial number. Like let's just say the serial number is 12345, except for it'll end up being 12345A and then 12345B. So double wides will have two titles, and it's often moved less than 5% of the time. Double wides are not very often moved. If you do happen to move one, make sure that you hire a reputable mover because there's some extreme important things to take care of when we're butting those two things back together. Getting a little off subject here, but I do that often. Doesn't really matter. And then I don't know how many people out here have seen triple wides or quads. I've heard of some that were five units wide. I've never seen one that was 5 units wide. I have seen a 3 wide. The 3 wide was kind of interesting. It was definitely not what I would have expected to have seen. But yeah, 3 wide mobile home is out there for sure. And I've heard of 4 and 5 wide homes. But same thing with double wides. Each section will have its own title, HUD label, and HUD plate. So easy to go through. You can see a couple of floor plans there of common mobile homes. But looking at some single wide construction examples, if I come over here, you can see very common, just got a single wide. This one's got a little front porch area built onto the front of it. That's kind of neat. Very typical construction styles. These do look like newer mobile homes, probably built in the 2000s and newer just because of the vinyl siding, the roof pitch, and the way that they've been finished out. Floor plan that you'll often see for one. If I go through here some double wides, you can see what this double wide here looks like when it's split apart. You can see that's how they move them. So if you're going down the highway and you see something that looks like that, that's half of a double wide. Floor plan for one as well. That one's a 32 foot by 76 foot. That's a pretty good size unit there. Sidings and roofs. Sidings and roofs are extremely important to you as a real estate investor because it really plays into your repair costs. I have my own preferences. I'll share my preferences with you, but overall it's going to be your choice as to what you invest in and how you invest. I just kind of have my little areas that I like to work in. One of the first things we'll talk about is the siding. The three that I see most often are vinyl siding, which is kind of like what we have a picture of right here. It's just a horizontal vinyl siding. What I see is very often with these homes is the vinyl siding doesn't last that long, especially on a home that's more than 15 years old. That vinyl siding over time, just the heat beats it up, at least here in Texas, and the heat tears the vinyl siding up and it starts cracking and bowing and becomes real brittle and starts falling apart. So if I'm driving through and I'm looking to purchase one of these, if it's got that vinyl siding on it and it's really beat up, you know, I might have to look at replacing that. I've got that whole thing in the repair section, so go take a look at that. But other things I look at are aluminum panels and panel boards. I prefer the aluminum siding. I can show you an example of that here in a second. But with the aluminum siding, I've just personally never had any problems with it. Like, it doesn't leak. It doesn't really, if it does look bad, if it is weathered, I can get the outside of a single wide home painted for about $800 to maybe $1,000. So the outside of an aluminum panel home doesn't really hurt my feelings much because it's easy to repair. If I look at the other one though, we start looking at panel boards. Panel boards are very common. It's like not MDF, but like a masonite exterior panel. Those are okay if they've been well maintained. What I mean by well maintained is that they're sealed, the water's not holding on them, and that they stay painted. But if they don't get painted and they don't get sealed, you'll start seeing rotting a lot of the times around the windows and right around where the skirting meets the walls. But those are the three types that I'll see often. Aluminum panels were really prevalent all through the 50s and 60s and 70s. As we started getting into the 80s, we started seeing more of the panel boards and vinyl siding, although you will see the aluminum siding all the way up into the 2000s, the aluminum panels, and I'll show you more about that here in a moment. Other things I look through while I'm driving through the park is what type of roof pitch do I have? Flat, curved, or pitched. What I have right there is an example of one that is curved. I'll show you some more of examples of the pitched roofs and the flat roofs. But if it's got a curved pitch, or if it's got a curved roof or a flat roof, you know it was built before 1983. We've discussed this in some of our previous slides. And then one of the last things is the roofing material. And with the roofing material, is it aluminum panels on the roof? Is it composition shingles, which is what you'd see on most houses? So if it's just like the regular shingles, that's what you'd normally see on houses, or a roof over. A roof over is an example of what we're seeing here on this particular roof. I don't know if you can tell, but it looks like they've taken some 2x4 and they've secured it to this roof, and now they're laying these aluminum panels over the top. By doing that, what they're doing is they're taking an old existing roof that's just no longer capable of really being repaired or cleaned up, and they're just building a new roof on top of it. So some examples of what you're looking at there. I, once again, like the aluminum panels on the roof. I've had other people complain about them, but what I've seen with the aluminum roofs is, worst case scenario, I can go buy a bucket of basically roofing tar and then just roll it across the roof and I'm good to go again. So just a couple of things to look at there. But here's one of the primary reasons for doing this specific course, is to give you an understanding of what the homes look like as they progress through the years. In this example right here, we're looking at what's probably an early 1950s mobile home. And some of the characteristics that I'm looking at on this to help decide what year built it is it is an extremely flat roof. So by knowing that it's a flat roof, some other things that I can look at is the width of the home. That's probably about a 10 to 12 foot wide home. I've got the horizontal windows, and I've got horizontal aluminum siding. All things that I'm looking at that are indicating to me that this home was built probably in the 50s, at latest early 60s. So we're going to go through and help figure these types of things out. Is my home built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? And if I'm driving through the park, I can get an idea of what these people are going to allow in. Primary characteristics of the 50s and 60s. These early homes were often less than 8 foot wide. Could you imagine that, living in an 8 foot wide home? Like, I've done it before. I remember my grandma had a mobile home when I was growing up, and her mobile home, I don't remember how wide it was, but my bedroom had like a twin bed in it, and I could touch from one side of the room to the other, and then right outside of the room was just a hallway that was maybe 30 inches wide. So that home probably wasn't more than maybe 8 foot wide, at most 9 to 10 foot at best. So just an 8 foot wide home is pretty small if you think about that. The 1950s is the start of the 10 and 12 foot wide. So a lot of the earlier homes, 8 foot wide. When you get into the 50s, they started selling what they call the 10s and 12s, which is what they're highlighting here. Prior to the 50s and 60s, a lot of the homes were not necessarily permanent installs. It was more of kind of like a camper RV type application. As we got into the 50s, 60s, the marketing really started transitioning into permanent living. So designs of the mobile home parks where the homes would go in, and or moving these homes onto land and just using them for permanent living all came around into the mid 50s and 60s. Rectangular shape made of painted aluminum panels. One of the things that we're going to look at on these aluminum panels is the 50s and 60s. The aluminum panels most of the time went horizontal, or a combination of vertical and horizontal. As we get into the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and even into the 80s and 90s, the aluminum panels started going vertical, and you'll see some examples of that here in just a second. But here's an example of what we're looking at probably in early 50s, very flat roof, horizontal aluminum paneling. We've got the I don't know what you call them, but the crank windows. You crank them to open them up, and those all pop open. If we look at the width of this thing, that looks like it might be 8 to 10 foot wide at best. So all things to take a look at. I'm going to say that that's a 1950s to probably a 1950s home. I'm going to lean towards probably a 1950s home. Here's another example of what I'm looking at. This one right here, I'd lean more towards probably the mid 60s. And why am I leaning towards the mid 60s? So we've got, yet again, horizontal aluminum paneling. But if I look at the roof, we've got this little bump up here in the middle. Or some people call them bump outs. I don't really know exactly what they're called, but we see an elevation change in the roof line. I see that more often in the 60s. So if I see a home like that and it's still got the aluminum panels and everything, I'm leaning towards 60s, maybe into the 70s. You don't see designs like that going into the 80s. They stopped doing that. But if I see this one, that's probably a mid 60s, early 60s home. Again, look at the width of it. I know it's hard to tell in these pictures, but if I'm looking at the pictures themselves, I don't know if you can get that on the screen now. So the width might be hard for you to eyeball just from looking at pictures or driving by, but my experience says that that guy's probably somewhere between the 10 to 12 foot range, probably closer to the 10. It's not a very wide home. If that's not a very wide home, I've got a curved roof. I do have vertical aluminum siding, so remember on the rest of them that was horizontal. On this one we can see it's clearly vertical. With that vertical aluminum siding and the width and the curved roof, I'm leaning towards a 60s built home. And this isn't life or death importance for you, but the more and more you're investing in mobile homes, it's better for you to be able to just quickly drive through a park or take a look at a picture and really quickly know what you're looking at. Keep on going. Here's a cool example. I put this one in here just because I thought it was really neat to see how the home was broke down. This is very similar to the home that I spent a lot of my time in as a child with my grandma. If we look at the width, it's not very wide, 10 to 12 foot wide. Living area up front, we got a kitchen here in the middle, and then we got a hallway that runs down here. This is very similar to what I was talking about as a kid. My bedroom was right here, and it was just a twin bed. But from the twin bed to the opening of the door was probably about 2.5 feet or so. And then the hallway was only, maybe 30 inches wide. So very small home, very small home. So let's go looking into what we're doing into the 70s. In the 70s, we started seeing quite a bit of change in these homes. Most of the homes coming through the 70s are probably about 12 foot wide. I said 10 to 12 foot wide, very common in the 70s to be 10 to 12 foot wide. But we started seeing a lot more solid curves coming into the roofs going into the 70s, into especially 76 when we started with HUD. Most of them are painted aluminum panels. I like the aluminum panels for me because they're easy to maintain, they're easy to clean up and remodel. Slightly curved / pitched roofs, you're going to see that. Like if you see a completely flat roof, guaranteed it wasn't built in the 70s. If it's a completely flat roof, probably back into the 50s. Possibly into the 60s. Once we got into the 60s, we started getting a really light curved roof, not too steep. As we hit into the 70s, the roofs became a lot more curved. I don't know if I have an example of that. You can see the curve on that one. This isn't a guaranteed 1970s home. I just started looking at pictures and tried to find ideas of ones that would look like the 1970s. But that one's got a little bit more of a prominent curve to it. Some elevation changes in the roof, kind of like pop-ups. I showed you that one on that last one where I said it was probably a 60s to a 70s home. You'll see these roof pop-ups where the elevation changes on the roof line and you'll see those quite often into the 60s and 70s. Quest Plumbing started coming around in the late 60s, early 70s. I hate Quest Plumbing. Most of these homes that you buy in the 70s, 80s, and even going into the 90s will have Quest Plumbing in them. It's very similar to PEX in the way it's installed and the way it looks, except for it's gray. So if you see that gray plumbing in these homes, it's called Quest. It's not called PEX. And anytime you move it, you mess with it, you work on it, it ends up leaking. So it turns into problems over time. But you can expect to see Quest in those types of homes. And once we get into the 70s, that was the beginning of the HUD regulations. HUD regulations coming in about 1976. So up to 76, slightly curved roofs. Past 76, they got a lot more prominent in the curving of the roofs. And then once we get into 83, they become pitched. So here's an example of what I would consider to be a 1970s home. That's between 10 to 12 foot wide. We've got an elevation change there in the roof line where you can see that kind of that pitch where the comes through. Looking at this home from the outside, like it's not a very sexy looking home. It's just not. But what I would tell you is all day long, that is the type of asset that I'm looking to purchase. Everything I can see about that home standing here looking at says to me that that home is something I'd want to buy. Because the outside of that home, the skirting doesn't look bad. I could clean up that skirting with a couple of screws and get it cleaned. The outside of that home doesn't look bad. So what I'm looking at right now is I could spend $1,000 to $1,200 to paint the outside of that house, do a little bit of landscaping, and the outside of that house looks beautiful again. When I say beautiful, it's about as beautiful as a 1970s mobile home can be, but you put nicer modern colors on these houses, they look pretty good. I go through, I replace the blinds, and I get a nice uniform appearance on the outside of that home. Outside of that home is good to go again. So I don't shy away from them. And with those being aluminum panels, I like those types of homes. So all day long, is that an asset that I would buy? Yes, if the price was right. Now, somebody who's asking $20,000 for that, But if it was in good shape and I thought I could get probably repairs done for less than $5,000, I'd probably pay anywhere between $3,000 to $5,000 for that unit is what I would probably be willing to pay. Okay, here's another example of a 1970s home, or what I would assume to be a 1970s home. It looks like somebody cut a sliding patio door into the side of that house. Tell me that's not intriguing. I'm not gonna say that's not a first, but that's definitely different. So 1960s, 1970s homes. We've once again got the crank out style windows where we've got a crank that pops those windows open. Now I've got the elevation changes in the roof, and I don't know what the inside of that home looks like, but it does look like it is currently parked in a mobile home dealer's parking lot. But if that was in a mobile home park, looking at it from the outside, I'm looking at that it definitely needs skirting. Let's just assume this is parked in a mobile home park and I'm not having to move it because I wouldn't move a unit like this. Looking at it, I know it needs skirting. I could budget probably about $1,000 to put skirting on a single wide. So, and then it needs painting, and I could probably put another $1,000 on there for painting. So I'm looking on the outside of this home about $2,000 plus porches being about $300 a pop for steps. I can do steps on one and probably about $800 for a decent little porch on the other one. So for the outside of that house, I can get it really cleaned up for about $2,500 to $3,000. So right now, I know that unit doesn't look all that appealing, but depending on how the inside of that home looked, I wouldn't shy away from it. You know, I really feel like I could probably clean up the outside of that house for about $2,500 to $3,000. And then if I look at the inside and I can get the inside of it done for about $3,000 as well, all into it for $6,000, and I could pay $1,000 to $2,000 for the unit, that sounds like a deal that I would do. I've done many deals that were similar to that. It just really boils down to what's the interior condition of that home look like. Here's another example. This is possibly a 70s home. I might lean a little bit more towards the 60s, but seeing what I'm looking at there, skinny. It's definitely wider than the ones we were looking at in the 50s, but that one's probably 12 foot wide. It's not very long. I do see an elevation change there on the roof. I've got the crank style windows. I've got vertical and horizontal aluminum paneling with a curved roof. Everything on there says in 60s to a 70s built home. And from the outside, once again, I see zero reason not to buy that unit. I have a lot of people that I work with that are used to the stick-built world, where in stick-built world, they're like, man, we've got to make this thing look beautiful. We've got to do a gut remodel on it. I'm going to spend $30,000. The most I've ever spent on a single single wide restoration was around $6,000. So I'm not spending a lot of money on these. $6,000 will cover some very low cost laminate, vinyl planking, or carpet. It will cover new 1-inch plastic mini blinds. It'll cover the painting of the inside and the outside of the unit and some repair patches on the subfloor. So if I look at skirting, exterior paint, interior flooring, blinds, maybe some new doorknobs, and possibly replacing the bathtub because they go bad over time, bathtub and toilet, I might spend $5,000 or $6,000 on an entire unit to do all of that. And the primary things I'm looking for are safe, clean, and affordable. So remember that while we're going through, and I know I've discussed this on several occasions throughout these videos, and I want to say it again because I even had a conversation at last month's real estate meetup, and somebody came up to me and they're showing me pictures of homes like this, and they just bought a park, and they're like, well, I need to throw all these things away. And I'm like, why are you going to throw all those things away? Those things are worth money. So is what it is. That right there is definitely a home I would consider keeping. So we get into the 1980s. 1980s is where design and construction really started going to the next level. We get into the 1983 range, and that home right there is not a 1983 home. That is likely a 2000 plus built home. But where you start struggling is once you get into the 80s and on, most of the homes start becoming very similar in their style. What you will see more often as you get into the 90s and further, and we'll talk more about that in a second, is that the 80s were fairly dominant with aluminum siding, vertical aluminum siding, and aluminum roofs. You will see composition roofs on these shingles. You'll essentially see shingles on these throughout the 80s, but it is very common to see the aluminum roofs, aluminum panels, and everything in the 80s from 1983 on is going to be a solid pitched roof. So what I mean by a solid pitched roof, we've got that really tight angle here. That right there, very, very, very common roof style. And you shouldn't see anything beyond that once you get into the 1983 and beyond. So here's some examples. Most of them are 12 foot plus wide. 1983 is when they started mandating the roofs. A little more squared off. You're not going to see the bump outs on the elevations in the roofs. You're not going to see weird looking, stuff on the outside. For the most part, they're squared. Quest Plumbing, once again, through the 80s. Construction standards definitely increased. But here's a common example of a 1980s built home, or what I would assume to be a 1980s built home. We have wood siding on the exterior. This is that Masonite style siding that I was talking about. We no longer have the crank style windows. We have a composition shingle roof on that one. If I'm looking at buying this, some of the things that you may or may not be able to see there on your picture is some of the soffit is rotted out. But if I just go in there and I clean up that soffit, the exterior paint on that is not bad at all to come through and clean. I'm not seeing a whole lot of required work to get the outside of that painted. So if I came in and I painted the outside of that home, and that's all I would really need to do other than putting in some flowers and just putting a little bit of landscaping out there, I could spend no more than $1,500 and the outside of that house is going to look pretty top notch. Things that I would need to know though is what condition is the roof in. I never want to put more than one layer of roof on a mobile home. We've discussed that in some of the other classes. No more than one layer. But if that roof's bad, I'd spend probably $1,800, depending on the width and length, anywhere between $1,800 to $3,000 to re-roof that house. So that's a composition shingle. That's not the same as an aluminum roof. So if you have composition shingles on a single wide, I'm leaning towards the low side of $1,500 to the high side of about $2,800 to do it. Outside paint, $1,200. That's a fairly classic example of the homes that I would try and go for. If I can get all of my homes built after 1983, those would be the ones I'd buy. But some of those examples are the ones back in the 70s. I'd do those all day long as well. Here's another example of a 80s home. That one's got vinyl siding on it. Here's another one. That one may or may not have wood siding on it. It looks like it might look like wood, but it's probably aluminum. Many times you'll see those aluminum panels painted in such a way that they don't necessarily look like they're wood. But that one's sitting on a lot. You can see how much they're asking for it, $9,000. That's probably a 14-foot wide home and every bit of at least 70 foot long. So $9,000 is what you're looking at there, plus moving and installation. I wouldn't buy that. That's me. I wouldn't buy that. But if it was already in a mobile home park and I didn't have to move it, $9,000 is more than what I'd want to spend. But I'd try and get it somewhere around $5,000 and probably put about $1,500 worth of paint on the outside, and probably about $1,500 worth of paint on the inside and some carpet, and then turn around and sell it. I'd probably be into it for around $8 to $9 grand. I'd probably sell it somewhere around the $25,000 to $30,000 mark on payments. But that is a very great example of a home that I would like to do, but I don't want to move it. When you start moving it, it really costs you more money than what you're going to want to spend. All right, so 1990s to today, we're going to be having competing quality. We've got a lot more manufacturers. We've got increased standards through HUD of the manufacturing quality, and then just different manufacturers like Jessup Homes here in Texas. Man, they have some beautiful homes. Like if I take the time to go out there and you just go look them up, I think it's JESSUP. They have homes that would be competing on the finish out for design styles of like your not $250,000 homes. Yeah, $250,000 homes. They got like wood shiplap. They've got designer fixtures. They got really nice flooring. So when you enter into some of these homes, they can look beautiful. So don't disregard, especially when you're getting into these newer homes, how nice they really can be. You get a nice double wide that's 40 foot wide and 36 foot wide and 80 foot long, and it's really nicely finished out. They're a good looking home. All right. So primary characteristics, 12 plus wide, pitched roofs, a little more squared pecs. You get into the 90s and 2000s, you'll see a lot more pecs. They got rid of the Quest, and you'll see a lot more CPVC. CPVC looks similar to PVC, except for it's not white. It's kind of a beige yellow. It's not bright yellow. It's kind of like a creamy colored tan. So that's CPVC, and the construction standards just increase as we continue moving further and further along. What I would anticipate being a 2000 plus built home. And that's overall what we're looking at there. I don't really have any direct homework for you on this class, but I wanted you to be able to drive through a mobile home park and easily tell what types of units you were looking at, or if you're going on a seller's appointment and you pull up, as soon as you pull up to it, you should be able to really quickly see, okay, this is what's going on with it, this is what's going on. And I believe it's going to be a benefit to you in your mobile home investing career to have that. So that's it for this particular course. Stay tuned for the next one we got coming up. I appreciate your time.